Hello everyone, it's James Humberstone here for the fourth podcast in the Educative Evidence-Based Practices podcast series, or EEBP podcast for short. I'm recording this podcast on the lands of the Guy Mariagal people, where songs were sung and stories were told for over 60,000 years before the Sydney Conservatorium was built in the colonial era. I do so respectfully and in acknowledgement that this sovereign land was never ceded and a treaty is yet to be signed. Today, I'm going to talk about a chapter that I'm working on for our books with the incredible composer, performer, and music researcher Jocelyn Ho. Jocelyn has been teaching at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music for years, but only joined us on faculty at the start of 2025. I was eager to meet her because I was impressed by her women's labour project, but when we chatted I discovered that we had much more in common because we were both interested in shifting the teacher-student relationship in the conservatory and in democratic approaches to curriculum design. We came to these ideas in quite different ways though. If you came to our first symposium in September 2024, you might have seen my paper on how I'd used EEBP to reframe student voice in one of my most successful courses, Technology in Music Education. It was one of the first courses that I wrote from scratch when I joined the Sydney Con in 2013. It has changed a lot over the years since, but there have been two consistent elements. First, that I begin with some weeks just focused on skills and then move on to 21st century culture that is mediated by technology, thus introducing more technologies but also different kinds of use and different musical cultures. Second, that we have a public element to the course. Students are blogging their work as they go, and we finish up with a public presentation of learning. Some of the students have been invited to national conferences to give these presentations to teacher audiences, and some of the projects done in this course have led to student employment in schools. In that first paper in 2024, and noting that this slide still shows the 2024 framework, I suggested that the course was already absolutely based on the latest research evidence because I was always looking at the latest technology and the latest changes in technology development and use, and then reading the research to see how I should engage with it academically. In topics such as the mobile phone ban or the use of AI in music education, there isn't a lot of research, and often what research there is contradictory, revealing a contested field. I ask students to engage in that literature and to explore it in their reflections. I like to think that I also bring great classroom expertise to the course. Not only was I a classroom music teacher for 12 years, but in the school with the first one-to-one laptop program in my state. I was also a product manager for a little UK music software company called Sibelius for nearly a decade. And at that time, I was touring my second music theatre hip-hop show. I explained that information from the classroom context was generally quite stable in my institution. A conservatory gets a particular kind of student and has really wonderful facilities to support the students. But these contexts do change over longer periods of time, such as when we introduced our first degree in contemporary music practice in 2016, as well as, of course, the way everything changed in lockdowns in 2020 and 2021. So that left the values, needs and circumstances of each student, and again this is the 2024 model, I'm going to move into the current one in a second. And I thought that before I considered the EEBP framework, I would have said that, hey, when it comes to student stuff, this is pretty great. After all, I get them to blog and I read what they make of the course when I mark their blogs, and I have research showing that the act of blogging makes them better critical thinkers, relating the research evidence directly to my students. I think the imperative to investigate the student experience would have been even stronger had I been using the current framework, and so this is where I bring you up to the current one. As you know from the first podcast in this series, feedback from our presentations at conferences and dialogic development through our editorial meetings have positioned the care, growth, and positive transformation of students at the centre of the framework, at the intersection of the four circles, and surrounded by pedagogical reasoning. So, the model had made me wonder. In this, probably the most evidence-based of all my courses, do I really listen to my students? Am I so persuaded by the evidence of what is happening in this field and what it means for music education that I'm perhaps not considering how my students are responding to this class year to year or over a long period of time? Maybe they need more skill development. Maybe the skills development is too simple. Maybe the comments I read from each student in their reflective blogging would have a different impact when taken as a group, rather than individually or longitudinally. And I've been teaching the course for 12 years, after all. And to cut a long story short, because I don't want to reprise a 2024 paper, going back through the student blogs over more than a decade, I discovered that while the feedback from the course was indeed generally positive, that students did identify weaknesses in the course that related to their prior experience, access to technology, dislike of the fact I'd been making them blog, and dissonance around their identities as a conservatory student, what kind of musician they perceived themselves to be, and their future careers as music teachers. To think deeply about how to go forward, I went back to the research evidence. In Freedom to Learn, Carl Rogers deals with the question of teacher and student autonomy. He said that respect, care, and trust were the key ingredients in the relationship. You can see where I'm going here. But essential to his person-centered learning is stopping being a teacher at all. As he said, quote, "To my surprise, I found that my classrooms became more exciting places of learning as I ceased to be a teacher." Rogers centres the values, needs, and circumstances of each student by insisting that all learning must have a personal meaning. I was encouraged to find that his workaround for grading a subject like this one was a combination of truthful student reflection, akin to the blogging I already asked my students to do, and a free choice essay of any length, akin to the student negotiated project that I have in this course. Perhaps the solution to relieve tensions between student and teacher desires and autonomy was to be more open about my expectations for learning in the course and to make those expectations less important than the students. Interestingly, as I was exploring Rogers' person-centered approach and considering what answers it held for me, I read that he himself had been at the forefront of opening up the field of psychology, which had previously been dominated by behaviorism, to empirical research in the 1970s, and had advocated for that research to influence practice, an important part of the medical evidence-based practice from which our model for music education is drawn. As Phillips writes, Rogers, quote, "Rogers saw behaviorism as at its best a starting point, but clearly not an end point. He moved beyond approaching clients with a preconceived solution for their problems, instead spending time and listening and then reflecting back to the clients what he had heard so that they would become more aware of what they were expressing." And so, the next year, this is the year after our first symposium, so now I'm in 2025, following what I had learned through the EEBP framework, I totally changed the course. First, I moved all of the content from different versions of the course over the years online. And in week 5, after I'd finished those basic skills teaching weeks, students voted on what they would like to do for the rest of the course. And I lifted Rogers' assessment task, cited in Freedom to Learn, adapting it for my course. Students were asked, 1. Using your professional online presence, whether it be a website, blog, social media profile, or any other digitally mediated public present, show your learning in this course through critical thinking and creativity, including, quote, your own most significant personal values and the ways they have changed or not changed as a result of this course. in any way you like: written reflections, essays, video, a song, graphics. Number 2, create a rubric to assess your own professional presence and the evidence of learning through critical thinking and creativity. And number 3, mark your own work according to your own rubric out of 45, explaining, quote, the way that you have met or failed to meet your own criteria. All those quotes lifted from Carl Rogers' book, Freedom to Learn. I'll talk about how this went in a moment, but you'll remember that I started off by telling you that Jocelyn and I had come to similar points through different approaches and for different reasons, and I was spurred on by EEBP to consider the student. Jocelyn, well, with her permission, I'm going to switch now to a video of a paper that we gave together recently, so she can tell her own story.
So my teaching is strongly guided by my belief that students should be treated as intellectual partners. As a teacher, I want to listen to each cohort's diverse interests and respond to what they deem to be important to their learning. So I found that when I taught theory, for example, every cohort in a different year would have different interests and different priorities, and I really wanted to be able to respond to that as each cohort comes my way. So I also value the principle of democracy. So students who present as more reserved, for example, myself when I was a student, should still be given an equal opportunity to assert their agency. And also just stepping back and reflecting through a self lens as a teacher, I also observed throughout the years that this traditional top-down student-teacher model never really worked for me. So as a woman of color, the teacher authority on which a traditional top-down model hinges was never a given. And many times it was even questioned as soon as I walked in the door. So when that power was never assumed, it prompted me to ask, how can sharing that power, not trying to hold on to it or insist that it be mine, be productive for student learning, for my well-being and authenticity as a teacher, and for building rapport with students. So in week 1 of my advanced analysis class, I asked students to reflect on their challenges in analyzing music and their hopes for this class. Then they worked in breakout groups to critique these given learning outcomes using these guided questions. So I'll just give you a few seconds to have a read through of those. And after the breakout activity, each group suggested one revision and one addition to my current learning outcomes. So after the class, I put all the revisions and additions that the breakout groups proposed into a table. So on the left column of this table, you can see. Students vote for these revisions and additions via dot polling. So these are those X's. So they can vote for their top 3 choices, meaning they can put up to 3 X's in the votes. Then finally, I revise the learning outcomes according to the most popular revision and addition. Then in week 6, Gavin and I responded to these revised and new learning outcomes. And what we did was we came up with 4 new topics to address them. So I came up with 2 and Gavin came up with 2. Students then voted for 2 topics that they wanted to be taught in weeks 9 and 10, which were slated for these co-designed topics. And again, this was done via dot polling. Now, for the topics that didn't get voted on, I uploaded resources online on Canvas for self-directed learning.
Jocelyn describes the work that she's been doing as co-design or co-creation after scholars such as Beauville, Kemi and Croft, or Jamil O'Connor and Shelton. As you can see, in practice and in the conservatory, it has resulted in many similar processes to the person-centered Rogerian approach that I took after using the EEBP framework to interrogate my teaching. But rather than doing a backward analysis to suggest that Jocelyn's work in the past has been EEBP, which, as you know, is the kind of work that we did cop a bit of criticism for in our book proposal reviews, we have been collecting new data as part of a multi-phase collaborative autoethnography and have just about finished the analysis of that now. As I prepared this podcast, I thought that perhaps one last recorded conversation we might have could be on Jocelyn's reflections on how the framework guided me and whether and how she might use it in future teaching periods. Findings at this point include a tension that we have discovered between giving students choice about what they might learn and their expectations of the typical neoliberal banking model of education. Isn't it their lecturers' jobs to identify what students need to know and then to teach it to them? Similarly, while many of my students enjoyed being able to choose topics for study and design their own project for assessment, they felt that Roger's idea of creating a rubric and marking themselves was a step too far. Again, that's their lecturer's job. I have to say, though, I did very much enjoy receiving a couple of students' work in my course where they wrapped their reflections on what they had learned, or their critical reflections, I should say. And of course, naturally, I took some time out to wrap my feedback along with sending them their marks. We've identified limitations of the democratic voting processes, such as those whose topics didn't get voted could become disappointed and feel unheard. While we had the impression that most students appreciated being able to give their opinions, some seemed less enthusiastic, even resistant. Boville refers to sticky cohorts. We've come up with some hypotheses for why this is. The mixed and negative outcomes were illuminating. It was surprising to us because the literature suggested that giving agency and levelling out the power hierarchy between teacher and student should have been entirely positive. So we continue our analysis and we'll come back to the EEBP framework to consider our next steps. That is our work through June, and that's how we'll complete our first draft by July 1. Thanks for listening to this podcast, and we look forward to talking to you as we come towards editing your chapters together to make these two fantastic books. Thanks, everybody.